What if the cost of changing the world was everything you have? We build monuments to our heroes and name holidays after their victories, but we almost never talk about the crushing personal price of that greatness. We praise people like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Joan of Arc for the world they built, but we conveniently forget the parts of themselves they had to burn down to do it. This is the story of the sacrifice hidden behind the history books. The history we learn in school is often a highlight reel. It's a story of courage, conviction, and impossible odds being overcome. We see the perfect statues carved from cold stone, the glorious paintings, the black and white photos of smiling leaders waving to crowds. But that sanitized version cheats us of the real story. It hides the devastating human cost of all that progress. The figures who truly reshape our world aren't gods, they're people. People who feel fear and exhaustion and despair. People who get their hearts broken, who miss their kids, and who lie awake at night, crushed by the weight of the very world they're trying to fix. For them, victory isn't some glorious moment. It's a war fought on two fronts, one against the injustice in the world, and another, more private war, against their own limits. Their own loneliness, and their own mortality. To change the world is to sign a contract, and the payment is almost always steeper than you can imagine. Today we are peeling back the layers of legend to find the flesh and blood human beings who paid that terrible price. We start in a war-torn kingdom with a young girl who heard the voice of God. In the early 15th century, France was on its knees. It was being torn apart by the brutal 100 Years' War with England. The English and their allies controlled most of the country, and the French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was uncrowned, indecisive, and about to lose everything. Hope was a currency scarcer than food. And then, a light appeared in the most unlikely of places. Her name was Joan of Arc. She wasn't a noble or a strategist. She was an illiterate peasant girl from a tiny village who knew more about sheep than she did about armies. But Joan had something more powerful than any training: absolute, unshakable conviction. Starting around age 13, Joan said she was visited by divine voices, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They gave her a mission that was both simple and insane: drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king. For years, she kept this to herself. But as the war got worse, the voices became more insistent. In 1428, at just 16 or 17, she finally acted. She walked to the nearby stronghold of Vaucouleurs and demanded an escort to meet Charles. They laughed at her, called her a mad girl. But Joan's belief was a force of nature. It was so pure, so intense, that it started to bend the world around her. She didn't give up, and her piety began winning people over. Eventually, the local commander gave in. When she finally stood before the Dauphin, her simple confidence was unnerving. Legend says that to prove her mission was divine, she told him the secret contents of a private prayer he had made to God, something no one else could possibly know. And in that moment, the desperate prince chose to believe. He gave the shepherd girl an army. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Dressed in white armor, holding a banner she claimed to love 40 times more than her sword, Joan led the French army to the city of Orléans. The city was on the verge of falling, but inspired by Joan's fearless faith, the soldiers rallied. In just a few days, they broke the siege and sent the English into a panicked retreat. Joan had done the impossible. She had turned the tide of the war. Her fame spread like wildfire, and she became a living symbol of divine hope, escorting Charles deep into enemy territory to be crowned King Charles VII. Just as her voices had told her. But here, at the absolute peak of her power, the fall begins. Joan's very existence was a threat. Her conviction was her greatest weapon, but it also made her an outsider. She was a woman in a man's world, a peasant leading nobles, a true believer in a cynical age of politics. While her soldiers loved her, many commanders were jealous. The king she had just crowned started to see her less as a savior and more as a political problem. He wanted to negotiate, but Joan, guided by her voices, insisted on pushing the attack. Her terrible price was paid first in isolation. The king she created began to distance himself. In May of 1430, she was captured by enemy soldiers. This was the perfect chance for King Charles VII, the man who owed her everything, to step in, to ransom her, to save the woman who had saved his kingdom. He did nothing. She was an inconvenience, an accused witch he couldn't afford to be associated with. Betrayed by her king, Joan was sold to the English. For her enemies, just killing her wasn't enough. They had to destroy what she stood for. They needed to prove she was a heretic sent by the devil, not a saint sent by God. This would invalidate Charles's crown and crush French morale. And so began her trial, one of history's most infamous shams. For months, the teenage girl, alone and in chains, faced down a court of powerful theologians. They tried to trap her with complex questions about doctrine, about her visions, about why she wore men's clothes. Yet the trial transcripts reveal her incredible spirit. Uneducated but brilliant, she dodged their traps with stunning clarity. They asked her a trick question. Are you in God's grace? To say yes would be heresy. To say no would be an admission of guilt. Her famous reply, if I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. But it couldn't last. After a year in captivity, under immense psychological pressure, she was worn down. In a moment of weakness, she signed a confession renouncing her visions, but just days later, she put her male clothes back on. A final act of defiance. That was all her enemies needed. They declared her a relapsed heretic. On May 30th, 1431, 19-year-old Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. She asked for a cross to be held high so she could see it as she died. She had saved France, but her country and her king abandoned her. The world she changed had consumed her entirely. From the medieval kingdom to the 20th century, the price of changing the world remains constant. Our next visionary faced a different kind of war, one of systemic, soul-crushing oppression. In the mid-20th century, South Africa was ruled by apartheid, a brutal system of racial segregation. A white minority government controlled every part of life for the black majority, where they could live, work, and travel. It was a society built on inequality. Into this world stepped a young, charismatic lawyer named Nelson Mandela. At first, he and the African National Congress, ANC, followed the path of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi. But the state always responded with violence. The turning point was the 1960 Sharpeville massacre, where police opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing 69 people. For Mandela, that was it. He concluded that decades of peaceful protest had achieved nothing. With a heavy heart, he co-founded Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. He went underground, becoming a master of disguise, organizing acts of sabotage against state infrastructure. He was the Black Pimpernel, the most wanted man in South Africa. His rise as a revolutionary was meteoric, but it was also brief. In 1962, he was arrested. This led to the infamous Rivonia trial, where Mandela and his comrades faced charges that could easily mean the death penalty. It was there, from the dock, that he gave one of the most powerful speeches of the century. Facing his own death, he concluded with words that would echo across the globe. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. He was spared death but sentenced to life in prison. This is where Mandela's rise ends and his long, terrible payment begins. He was sent to Robben Island, a windswept rock in the ocean designed to break political prisoners. For the next 18 of his 27 years in prison, this was his entire world. The price, first and foremost, was his life. Not his death, but his life. He was 46 when he went in. He was 71 when he got out. He lost nearly 3 decades. Think about everything that happens in a person's life in that time. For Mandela, all of it was stolen. His cell was tiny. He spent his days doing hard labor in a quarry, where the harsh glare permanently damaged his eyes. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the personal cost. He sacrificed being a husband and a father. He couldn't be there for his wife, Winnie, who faced her own hell of harassment and imprisonment. He couldn't watch his children grow up. He was a father who couldn't comfort his daughters, a husband who couldn't protect his wife. To fight for the future of his nation's children, he had to give up the present with his own. The psychological toll was immense. The apartheid regime tried everything to break him. They offered him freedom multiple times, if only he would renounce the armed struggle. It was so tempting. Freedom for just a simple statement. But Mandela knew his freedom meant nothing if his people weren't free. He refused. Every single time. In that refusal, he paid for his principles with decades of lost time. When he was finally released in 1990, the world held its breath. After 27 years of suffering, he had every right to be filled with hatred. But the man who emerged wasn't a man of vengeance. He was a man of forgiveness. The decades of suffering had forged in him the profound understanding that reconciliation Reconciliation, not revenge, was the only way forward for South Africa. His personal tragedy became his nation's salvation. While Mandela fought his battle, another visionary across the Atlantic was waging a war for the soul of a nation. He fought a similar evil, racial segregation, but with a radically different weapon. In the 1950s and 60s, America was a land of contradictions. It called itself the land of the free. But millions of its black citizens lived under the boot of Jim Crow. They were denied the right to vote, forced into separate, unequal schools, and lived under the constant threat of violence. This is the world that called Martin Luther King Jr. to leadership. He didn't seek it out. An eloquent Baptist minister, the role was thrust upon him during the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. But he answered with a vision that would change America. Nonviolent resistance. This wasn't a passive strategy. He called it a sword that heals. It was a form of combat that demanded incredible courage. Under his leadership, the civil rights movement became an unstoppable moral force. From bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins to the brutal marches in Birmingham, King and his followers met hatred with love and violence with peaceful defiance. They put the ugliness of segregation on display for the whole world to see. His rise hit its peak at the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his monumental "I Have a Dream" speech. In that moment, he articulated a vision of America so powerful it's been etched into the nation's conscience. His leadership was critical in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, laws that dismantled legal segregation. He had reached the mountaintop. He was changing the very fabric of American society. But for every step forward, a terrible price was paid. King's cost wasn't years in a prison cell, but a life lived in a psychological prison of constant fear, exhaustion, and surveillance. The most immediate price was the daily threat of death. His house was bombed. He was stabbed at a book signing, an attack he barely survived. Death threats were constant. He had to find the courage not just to lead, but to simply walk out of his house every morning, knowing it might be his last. Then there was the psychological war waged by his own government. The director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, saw King as a dangerous radical and became obsessed with destroying him. The FBI wiretapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and followed his every move, searching for any personal failing they could use to blackmail him and discredit the entire movement. He had no privacy, no space to just be a human being. His struggles with depression, his moments of weakness, all of it was weaponized against him. This led to a profound and crushing exhaustion. The weight of millions rested on his shoulders. He was constantly traveling, speaking, and marching, all while trying to be a husband and a father. In private, he confessed his fears and his weariness. He was a man running on the fumes of his faith, and he knew his time was short. That sense of impending doom hangs over his final speech, given in Memphis on April 3, 1968, the night before he was killed. His words are now chillingly prophetic. He told the crowd, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now." He said he no longer feared any man. "I've been to the mountaintop," he declared, "and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The very next day, he was assassinated. He was only 39 years old. He had led his people to the promised land, but just as he suspected, he wasn't allowed to enter it himself. A teenage girl burned alive. A revolutionary who lost 3 decades of his life. A preacher assassinated in his prime. Joan of Arc, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. Their victories are foundational to the world we live in. They taught us about conviction, forgiveness, and justice. But their stories aren't just triumphs, they're tragedies. They show us that changing the world isn't clean or glorious. It's a brutal, soul-crushing business that demands everything. It demands your youth, your family, your freedom, and far too often your life. The monuments we build capture the glory, but they erase the pain. The holidays we celebrate honor the victory, but they forget the cost. Their lives force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress is paid for with immense human suffering. The people we hold up as icons are the ones who were willing to absorb the hatred and violence of their time, so that a future generation might live with a little more freedom, a little more justice, and a little more hope. So the question their legacies leave us with isn't just whether we admire their courage. It's whether we truly understand the depth of their sacrifice. Because history shows time and again that to change the world, the price you must be willing to pay is terrible. If you find these stories from the shadows of history compelling, subscribe and join us for more, and let us know in the comments which historical figure's sacrifice resonates most with you. Thanks for watching.